Hi there. Wait, this is my first ever Instagram live. So this will be probably a bit wobbly in the beginning. Welcome to It's Complicated's first ever Instagram live, where I'll be talking with Katharina Albrecht, who is a psychologist and has a postgraduate diploma in refugee care. And I am just going to see how it works. Invite to join. So let's see if Katharina is in here. Yes. Did I just invite you? Good to see you. And hi there. Okay. And Katharina is asking, how do I join? I actually thought that I invited you, but maybe I didn't. Wait, let me try again, Katharina. Okay. Now I'll click the blue button, join again. Did something happen? Did it work? Sorry. This is a bit confusing. Oh, it says Katharina is unable to join. Okay, I think that third time is a charm, so I will try to invite you again, Katharina. Invite, and let's see if I'm right. No, okay. And she should be with us in just a second. And I'm Johanne, by the way. I'm one of the co-founders of the platform and the community It's Complicated. And I'm a psychologist also. And that's actually the main bulk of my work, is I do online client sessions. And over this past week, I've been working mainly on the initiative Therapists for Ukraine. And it's kind of a sub-page or a sub-community of It's Complicated, where, oh no, Katharina is unable to join. Okay, I'm just gonna try once more. Accept. Accept. Let's see. You have no requests. There! Yes! Good to see you.
Hello.
Katharina, welcome.
Hi, good to see you too. I don't know.
Yeah.
Can you hear and see me? So I think the problem was that I was on my computer, which I would prefer to be, but it doesn't seem to work. So
you were so right.
That's
that's totally right. It actually doesn't work with the computer. Yeah, I've only tried to be a guest in other people's Instagram live, so I should have told you, because I've never been the host. I don't think so, unless I've forgotten somehow. But yeah, so but good to see you. I was just
yeah, good to see you too, and I can see some familiar names.
Great.
It's really nice to hear.
So we decided to do this very spontaneously, you and I, or I asked you only 2 days ago, I think, and then I posted about it yesterday. But it's because we know each other, in that we've met each other once on the streets, or twice, and then we. You have your current private practice at the same address where I used to have my private practice. And I was also, I was just explaining before you managed to join, I was just explaining the Therapist for Ukraine initiative, because this is also the the reason that we'll be talking today. And I was saying how it's this initiative which also just was created on a whim, since I guess it was 10 days ago. One of its complicated therapists, Stefano Pani, reached out to us and asked, isn't there a way we can mobilize the network of therapists to offer pro bono sessions for Ukrainians and those directly impacted by the war. And so we asked our co-founding developer, Christoph, can't you just like make a category page? And then a lot of people have joined, and a lot of therapists are now offering their services. But besides that, we're also receiving a lot of requests from both from people impacted by the war, and also from people who are volunteering their help and their homes, whether we can provide some kind of guidelines, some resources about how to act, how to speak to people in forced displacement. Because I think a lot of people are just all of a sudden from one day to the other, they're in a position of care, and maybe they have never been in a position of having to care for a person in crisis. So that is why I wanted to speak to you, because besides being a psychologist, you also have a postgraduate diploma in refugee care. So maybe actually, could I just ask you to briefly explain what that is?
Get me to say. Yes, so I mean, I primarily these days I work as a sex and relationship counselor and therapist, but I did when I was still living in London, which is also where I did most of my university education and degrees. I did do a postgraduate diploma in refugee care from the University of Essex, and they have a very kind of almost, I'd say, like sort of world famous the Institute for Psychosocial and Psychoanalytic Studies is particularly sort of advanced there and progressive, and I found that really interesting. And I've also, when I was living in London, I worked at a psychosocial think tank, which was a sort of participatory way of working with refugees or involuntarily displaced persons.
Yeah. And how far back is this?
This is now, I was sort of on and off in London in the last few years. So this is now, I would say, 5 years ago. And then here in Berlin, my recent, my last job was, I was working at the Corona intensive care unit at Charité. And I was also sort of there working with people who had experienced like a major life change. They'd experienced like major upheaval due to like a severe COVID infection, and they would then kind of be in a position where they had to reassess their lives and kind of like start everything and relearn everything. So that I feel like I came into contact with a lot of sort of traumatic experience, but also post-traumatic growth, I would say.
Then. And so when you as a psychologist and like a friend of many, are you getting a lot of requests now, like in just from friends and people affected by the war, and who are like asking you for insights, or asking you to empower them to
I do have, I wouldn't say that it's very noticeable, that my work is sort of, I would say, mostly still the same that it was 4 weeks ago. And I still mostly work with couples with relationship issues, but I do actually have a couple of cases where people have, they are directly affected because they have family members in the Ukraine, or they have family members who work as journalists in the Ukraine. And so they are sort of in a position where they are just waiting to hear, which is, I think, one thing about the refugee or the experience of involuntary displacement is that it actually involves a lot of waiting. It's sort of often portrayed as people are just running, they are running for their lives, sort of thing. But quite often there is actually, even if things happen very unexpectedly and very sudden, which I suppose this situation was, it was just very sudden. I'd been following it on the news, and it was like from one day to the next, it almost felt like now there's a war, and now it's, I don't know if this was also your experience, but I felt like I kind of, there was a way of seeing it coming, but I also just did not expect it to kind of pan out the way that it did. But I think still there's often like people sort of, which I think is ignored in the contemporary dominant discourses on displacement, is that it sort of, it's portrayed as, okay, something happens to you, you're completely wiped out immediately, like, you lose your memory, and you are just now this helpless person, kind of seeking refuge. But I think that oftentimes what happens is that people actually do have a sense of it coming, and they make, more often than not, informed decisions as to what the next right thing to do would be. But then it still involves a lot of waiting around, waiting for visas to get approved, or for train tickets, or for family members to like be able to join. And I think that that's what my clients currently are experiencing too. This sort of, it's everything, it seems very urgent, and at the same time there's a complete sort of like a passivity almost to the experience, where you're just sitting waiting.
And so was that a big part of your studies at the university? Was that getting an understanding of the complexity of the refugee experience? And
yes, I would say so. And I my first degree is in psychosocial sciences, so I have always kind of, which focuses more on the intrapsychic dimensions of human life, but also the interpersonal, and then the social and collective dimension. And I think that the degree that I did then, or went on to do, was very much also looking at these different dimensions of mental health. We look at what is going on in the person internally, what are fears, what are experiencing, what experiences, what are the feelings, what is sort of triggered from the past, perhaps, but then also what happens on an interpersonal level, where, how are family relationships affected by this? Like a teenager about to leave, a teenager who's like ready to date and meet a meaningful other, might feel very differently about having to leave and uproot than an elderly person, for example. And so how do these family relationships really also are affected, and then the social and collective, like what is sort of, you know, culturally relevant to us as a nation or as a group, or and so yeah, I would say that this degree focused a lot about, first of all, like kind of looking critically also at Western approaches to the sort of Western idea of psychologizing in a situation like that, where there's like sort of the assumption that refugees are a group of people who share a specific psychological condition, when actually what they share is the fact that they've lost their home and there's like adversity in their host country, but they are not necessarily a psychological group. They are sort of I'm saying they, but you know, that sounds a bit like othering already when I say it like that. But it's more perhaps talking about a socio-economic group or a socio-political group, or so there's that. I think that's important to remember, that people may not necessarily be traumatized. They may have encountered severe traumatic experiences, and they've and they might, as a result, sort of have display like a temporary frozenness, which is kind of could be seen as a very healthy response to a shock. Yes, so it was a lot about sort of that, the different stages to the refugee experience. Often we kind of focus only on now. You know, people are kind of now, where are they now when they are like sort of trying to get to host countries or to a safe haven? But there's stages before that, and also stages that follow that. So I suppose the degree kind of helped to broaden out the
But now it seems like you already kind of debunked like 3 common myths, at least in like the, you know, Western approach to the refugee experience. Like, as you know, correct me if I'm paraphrasing wrong, but you know, one being that it's not a state of flight or running necessarily, but that there's also like a lot of waiting, and what that does to human experience, and then the other being that it's not like a psychological group or a group of similar psychological traits, but as psychopolitical.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, or at least not just. So it's not just a psychological group, or it's not just about.
yes, of course.
I mean, people might also be running for their lives. So I think sometimes, you know, it can then go, I feel like within psychological discourse, it can then go into the other extreme, where people are saying, no, these are all sort of heroes and survivors, and ignore that actually, yes, there might be severe trauma, and there might be sort of, but at least for now, yes, to say it's not just that. There's more to the experience.
And then the third thing you mentioning, which I think is a very important point, is also you know, like the notion of trauma, that the refugee experience is not necessarily a traumatized experience. It could also just be a, you know, a very normal response to a very abnormal crisis situation.
Right. Yes, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a very good point you're making. It's a perfectly, can be seen as a perfectly normal response to circumstances that are not very normal. And I do try and stress this a lot when working with people, that to kind of to kind of normalize it, to say, well, it, you know, because people sometimes they get like terribly worried about the fact, for example, that they're not sleeping, because I think that innately we as humans know, or when we're not sleeping and we have these terrible thoughts that are just kind of like, you know, spinning, it feels as though there's something really wrong with you in that moment. And if then you encounter a healthcare professional who sort of overemphasizes those symptoms over perhaps other symptoms, which is that you've just made a very informed decision to save you and your family, that's like, that takes considerable strength, for example. Or you may not be sleeping, but you made a really good decision to go out and go for a walk or something, to sort of stress there. Because I think that, I mean, while saying that it's sort of, there's, people make informed decisions, I think that the refugee experience can also, is just very fragmented, because people, I worked with refugees in a sort of in a kind of refugee resettlement center here in Berlin, and oftentimes people come, they arrive in one place, say in Turkey. This was back Syrians would arrive, for example, in Jordan or in Turkey, and then they would start building a life there, but that was not the place that they would like to, would have chosen to live and stay. So they applied for visas to move on and go on. And so, but in the meantime, they would have developed, like, built completely new lives, say in Turkey. And then 5 years later, they get the note that they can now come and live in Germany, and then they arrive in a kind of temporary home there. And so the experience in itself is actually very fragmented, because in every, and if there's children that go to school, there will be teachers and social workers and government officials, and they just change all the time, and it's just sort of like one thing after the next. There's a lot of bureaucracy involved, and so I do think that the narratives around the experience are very fragmented, but then the idea for, like, which I think is an important kind of indication for mental health professionals and people working therapeutically, that yes, you kind of work with people perhaps in a way to emphasize what has been coherent and what has been the entire time, and what is really sort of like identity stabilizing, rather than kind of focusing on all the things that are wrong. And again, that's not to sort of say that people might not need more long-term psychological professional help.
So this reminds me of something that I read many places when I tried to gather resources about how to communicate effectively and respectfully with people in forced displacement. Was this point of showing interest for the person independently of the refugee experience or the like war experience, also just to show interest in the person, you know, like outside all of that. It's not that the words values were mentioned in those readings, but that's what came to my mind, that it's also, it seems to be pointing to, you know, like more values-based work.
Yes, absolutely. I think that there's something called like the refugee condition, and then there's something which is the human condition, which is, you know, I think that we, like, all of us have something that is important to us, and that kind of, if we had to move and even, you know, at a certain upheaval, these things just don't get wiped necessarily.
Wait,
Like they don't, they
is
don't
there
suddenly
echo
like,
where you are, or was it just with me? No, now it's gone. It's gone. Yeah.
sit back. Oh, it might have been my finger on the microphone. Yeah, I think that it's there's this therapy being effective when it touches something that actually it rings true to you as a person and to your values. I think otherwise it's a sort of, and also it's often something that people have to do. So they come here and they, in order to find, say for example, an apartment, a permanent apartment more quickly, it helps if you have a psychological or psychiatric diagnosis. So people have kind of learned along the way that there are ways. If you are particularly vulnerable, you might get housing more quickly. So I think there's something as well in the system which can be a bit disempowering, because the emphasis is so much on all the things that are actually wrong, and you get help quicker that way. And so by all means, like, you know, if people learn to play the system, that's great, but it also, I would say, emphasizes or kind of helps to, like, you know, kind of pass on certain elements of the experience which are not necessarily healthy and don't necessarily reflect how people are really feeling. Yes, so there's the value-based way of working, which is also, I guess, in a way, because one thing to be very mindful of is to the risk of re-traumatizing
Yeah.
someone by addressing the wound, tending to the wound more, you know, quickly than is necessarily. It's like kind of ripping up the plaster. That plaster or band-aid that's there is actually really healthy. As a defense mechanism, we need defenses in these adverse times.
So you know, when people worry, and now maybe I should also include those who aren't counselors and those who aren't therapists and aren't doing therapy with refugees, but also people volunteering their homes and support in different ways. But if we assume that that could be a worry, like, you know, I don't want to say something that might re-traumatize or that might just be received in like in the wrong way. What could you offer some insight on that, on something that might, you know, guide people in a
Yes, I think something that I haven't mentioned, but I think it's really important also to say that there are, of course, also people who are more vulnerable. Like, these kind of political upheavals or adversity always affect those the most vulnerable the most. It's a kind of, so thinking about LGBTQIA plus people who might then not get the sort of treatments that they need, or, you know, that already have experiences of being sort of oppressed in their host country. There's this might then trigger all sorts of old fears that these people have already kind of been living with for many years, or the elderly, or people who have physical, on the spectrum of physical mental disability, which is always, I think, that when we talk about this, we assume there's, like, for better or worse, we assume that there's a big mass of people and they are all one, and the best way to get help or to intervene, and I suppose there is sometimes no other way, that we have to intervene somehow and offer humanitarian help, but what gets lost really is the complexity in that, and so then these people come into contact with folks in the host country. I think that there's a very what could be quite empowering to know for people taking in involuntarily displaced people, is to know that it's sometimes enough to kind of think therapeutically or think psychosocially, or that we actually don't have to be an expert on it, in this at all. I think this is the people themselves are often the experts of their own story. Like, they will know very well what they need.
So could it be said as simple as that thinking therapeutically is like honoring the person in front of you's story? Or, I mean, what, like, thinking therapeutically, like, how would you describe that?
Yes, what actually yes, and that's also, like, a part of me that's very sort of, you know, there's like a sort of, in my ideal world, everyone would sort of have an understanding of sort of certain I've lost the word somehow, but in my ideal world, everyone would kind of be psychologically or therapeutically minded. That means that there's resonance and there's active listening and there's sort of yes, I think that so, but it could look like exactly to sort of go on the assumption first and foremost that the person that is in front of me is a person who has lost their home, whether that's temporarily or permanently, we, I suppose, don't know at this point. And so there's also, like, that's good to keep in mind. It might not be that they've lost everything and are completely helpless, but they might actually have quite a good network at home, and they might have, you know, many more resources than we might think. So yes, this person in front of me is a person who has probably lost their home and is in sort of has a well-founded fear of danger in their country of origin, but that they've also gone a significant way to leave, and they've made these informed decisions, and that their strengths in that, and that perhaps they themselves know best what they would need right now. And also on the note of what I've mentioned before, temporary frozenness, that the person might be temporarily frozen by the experience. That means that certain these values that we talked about before, or beliefs, like core beliefs, they might temporarily sort of not know who they are because of, you know, what happens when you encounter, like, a scary event, is that you kind of become very single-minded. You focus on the next thing, and there's no time to think about anything else. But if you come into contact with a person like that, it might seem as though they, you know, don't know who they are, or they're very helpless. It could just be that they are in survival mode. So to kind of, I think what people do often when they want to help is to stop their own lives in their tracks and just be very sort of hyper focused on the needs of the other person. But I think that what could be a good, could be like valuable in that situation is to encounter a home or a life in your temporary home and a family and people who just are authentic and they are in touch with their feelings and they kind of, where there's resonance there, rather than becoming like the other that we don't know how to, like, to just sort of, yes, assume that the person will know themselves what's best and what they need.
Is there
Yeah.
Is there a way to distill that into, like almost like concrete advice or concrete tips?
Yes, I feel like this is something that we could talk about a lot more. And in fact, we have started working on developing some guidelines, because I think there's both on the kind of actually intervention level, psychological intervention for therapists. There's a lot of like really great tools that people can use. I don't know if you've heard about the Tree of Life project, for example, or anything narrative. Narrative work could work really well. Storytelling. There's also what I found with working with refugees in London was that to give these communities an opportunity to rebuild themselves, to sort of form groups and go into it's I don't know if it's too early as well. There's also this idea that when your house is on fire, you don't sit down and do therapy. And perhaps it was like when COVID happened and the people that were directly affected, like the relatives in the intensive care unit, they didn't necessarily want to speak to other people, relatives in a similar position, because it's almost like it's just too soon to start kind of processing anything. So, but that might be an idea to kind of work a lot more with kind of community-based projects.
This also reminds me that I should tell the people listening in right now that in the link tree, I think it's called, of this here Instagram page, I think I've managed to make the first link point to a Google Doc, which is like volunteer guidelines that I put together based on different resources. And then when Katharina, when you and I have had some more hours to draft something that's more extensive, more like therapeutic, or like getting down into the nitty-gritty of working with refugees therapeutically, then that will be added to the link tree. And then a thing that you said that also reminded me of some very, very like useful literature and a useful practice is the whole practice of outsider witnessing within narrative therapy. That down the line, I can imagine this sort of thinking also benefit therapeutic work with people in involuntary displacement, because this is the
Mm. 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 Yeah. Yes, and I think absolutely, and there's the storytelling element, and then there's also um, having someone outside of me witness my experience, and the role of the other is very important here in that it's a really a witnessing role, but you witness also the things that are good, and people, I find I feel very, very grateful and very privileged in that I have heard, I have so much experience in working with refugees and also my clients to an extent now. I really do get to witness a lot of beauty, because people will talk about something that, and there's a great book that it's called S, and I wish it's actually a novel. I wish I remembered maybe we can post it later, the author's name, where actually there is often, like, which is overlooked, that there's like incredible strengths in people, that they even people who are, you know, in very, like, people in prisons who are political prisoners, my clients have told me that there might be a friend who, for example, they communicated with each other through the walls, and they communicated when the wardens were there and why they were being tortured. This is like, while they were being tortured, they would knock on the wall and have some sort of Morse code to communicate with each other. And I think these sort of moments, there is actually in that moment where someone chooses, this is happening to me, but I'm also sort of dissociating, and I'm making contact with somebody, or I'm just thinking about my mother in my head in that moment, or I'm thinking about a dream that I have for my future or something. That these kind of things is, I think that's where outside witnessing becomes so important, because these people themselves might not think much of that it's just something that I thought about in that moment, but it's actually something you thought about, which was a decision also for life. It was a decision to kind of make it through this, and so that kind of to mirror back that strength, that there is actually agency when people have to think that they have no agency whatsoever. They are constantly making decisions that are preserving themselves, and to just kind of almost celebrate this. Yeah. Listening. Okay, great. And I was wondering also if perhaps those listening in have perhaps a
Let's
question,
definitely
or
open
would
the
like
floor
to comment.
for questions. I think now would be a great time, and while we wait on eventual questions, I should also say that I am currently trying to convince Katharina to join me for like a more, I guess you would call it like more moderated stage kind of Q&A, where I would invite you, Katharina, together with a couple of other mental health professionals with experience, and specifically the refugee experience, and like first aid psychology or psychological care, first aid mental health, bring you together, interview you, record it via Zoom, and so there is more to come.
Yes, and thank you so much for asking me to do this as well. This is actually my first Insta Live, and I feel really, I'm grateful for you and to be doing this with you, because I feel like you, just completely, I was so nervous beforehand, and it completely felt like a great conversations, of which we had a few. So,
likewise, it was really very enjoyable to pick your brain, and I hope Instagram Live, I'm so non-tech savvy, but I hope it records itself, or that it gets stored, because then I will of course share it.
Yes, I don't know how to do that either, but I thought that they were saying
but yeah, I guess the last thing that I also want to do, now that you also mentioned some books, and we talked about like narrative practices and outsider witnessing practices. Yes, Tree of Life. When I find out where this recording hopefully is stored, I can turn that into a post, and then in the comments I can put in those resources for those interested.
Yes.
Yeah. So
okay. Great.
Yes.
Like now I might soon have to
of course.
go back to
Thank
my
you so much for
science,
taking the time, and thank you to all of the viewers. Also, if you have any questions that you only come up with in a couple of minutes, send them to us. Write us a direct message, and I'll pass on the question to you, Katharina. If yay!
Right. Yes. That sounds good.
A lovely day to you and to everyone else. And
you too. And thanks to all the listeners. Bye.
How do I even end this? There.